today. This is Unit 6. Day 6. Unit 6, Day 6. Solving quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. We did the quadratic formula back in Algebra 1. And here's the quadratic formula up here at the top. It's x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So make sure you copy down that quadratic formula. We'll be using it for these problems. And the quadratic formula only works if your equation is in standard form. ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. You have to be in standard form first. So it has to equal 0. So x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, and in the denominator it's 2a. Copy down problem number 1. Problem 1, we have x squared plus 10x plus 16 equals 0. X squared plus 10x plus 16 equals 0. Yes? Oh, I thought you had a question. Okay, the first thing we need to do is check to make sure our equation is in standard form. Is this equation in standard form? Yes, it equals 0. So since it's in standard form, we're going to write down the value for a, b, and c. So a is just the coefficient for x squared. So the number in front of x squared is 1. B, we talked about b yesterday when completing the square, and the b is just the coefficient of x, which is 10, and c is the constant, which is 16. So those are the three numbers we're going to substitute into the quadratic formula. So here's the quadratic formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So there's the quadratic formula. You don't have to memorize it. It'll be on the formula chart for our next test. Our next test will be next week, Wednesday. No, it looks like Tuesday. It's going to be on Tuesday. Review Monday, test on Tuesday. I'm looking at my paper organizer over there. I see a hole on Tuesday. I'm not going to just leave your test out there in the open. So Tuesday. Okay, so now all you have to do is fill in the values for a, b, and c. So right here where we have negative b, this means the opposite of b. So if b is positive 10, what's the opposite of positive 10? Negative 10. So negative b means take the b value and change the sign. So positive 10, change it to negative 10. Then we'll have plus or minus. Under the square root, we need to take the b and square it. So what value do I use for b? 10. So this would be 10 squared minus 4. What does AC mean? A times C. Yeah, so AC means A times C. So this negative 4 needs to be multiplied by A is 1 and C is 16. And in the denominator, what does 2A mean? That means 2 times A, and what do I put for A? 1. Now we need to do some simplifying. So when you do your simplifying, I want you to have your negative 10, your plus or minus, and when you simplify, I want just one answer under your radical. And in the denominator, I just want one number. So go ahead and simplify the denominator. What's 2 times 1? 2. Now, when I simplify what's under the radical, start with the exponent. What's 10 squared? 100. I'm just going to do a scratch work over here. So 100 minus, what's 4 times 1? What's 4 times 6? Sorry, that's 4 times 16. What's 4 times 16? 64. So what's 100 minus 64? 36. So the number that should go under the square root should be 36. And I know the square root of 36. What's the square root of 36? 6. So after you get one number, simplify your radical. So this would be negative 10 plus or minus 6 divided by 2. Does that simplify? Yes. To do the first one, we need to do the addition. So we need to do negative 10 plus 6 divided by 2. And to get the second answer, we do negative 10 minus 6 divided by 2. So to get your first answer, do the addition. To get your second answer, do the subtraction. So if we do the addition, what's negative 10 plus 6? So this would be negative 4 over 2. And what's negative 4 divided by 2? Negative 2. So there's our first answer. X equals negative 2. For our second answer, do the subtraction. What's negative 10 minus 6? Negative 16 divided by 2. What's negative 16 divided by 2? Negative 8. So negative 2 and negative 8. Okay, number 2, we have 3x squared plus 5x plus 1 equals 0. 3x squared plus 5x plus 1 equals 0. Now for quadratic formula, it has to be in standard form. Is this one in standard form? Yes. So write down A, B, and C. So what's the value for A? 3. What's the value for B? What's the value for C? 1. And then write down your quadratic formula. X equals negative B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC all over 2A. What does negative B mean? That means the opposite of B. So if B is positive 5, what's the opposite of positive 5? So negative 5 plus or minus the square root. What do I put for regular B? 5, so this would be 5 squared minus 4. What does AC mean? Multiply. So we need to multiply A times C, and what is A? 3. What is C? 1. And in the denominator, we'll have 2 times A is 3. Now, the next thing I want you to do is simplify. I want one number, one number, one number. So this is just to eliminate our photomathers. And the denominator was 2 times 3. 6. Over here, simplify. We want just one number under the radical. So I'll do the scratch work over here. What's 5 squared? 25. Then put your minus. Now we need to multiply these 3. What's 4 times 3? What's 12 times 1? 12. So this is just 25 minus 12. What's 25 minus 12? 13. Now for this one, we need to see if this radical will simplify. So after you have one number, one number, one number, look at your radical and see if it simplifies. So can I simplify a square root of 13? No. Then the next thing you need to check is check your 3 numbers. So check your negative 5. What number's in front of the radical right here? A 1, and then we have a 6. So these 3 numbers need to be checked. Let me just highlight where they'd be. You need to check this number, the number out front of the radical, and the number in the denominator. And see if they have a common factor. Do they have a common GCF? No. But if they did, you would reduce it. And we'll have some examples like that. So that's the answer. It's just negative 5 plus or minus square root of 13 over 6. So if you're trying to use some sort of technology to assist you and you put down some decimal answers, you're not going to be getting credit. So make sure you're doing the same thing we're doing in class. Next one, number 3, we have 2x squared minus 16x equals negative 27. 2x squared minus 16x equals negative 27. Yeah, is this equation in standard form? No, what has to move? Yeah, it has to equal 0, so move the negative 27 to the other side. So this would be 2x squared minus 16x. And what happens to negative 27 when we move it to the other side? Changes to positive 27. And that equals 0. Then go ahead and list your values for A, B, and C. So what is A? 2. What is B? Negative 16. What is C? 27. Now, I would suggest to you to write down the quadratic formula each time. That way, the correct values go in the correct place. So the quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. And once you've written down your quadratic formula, substitute in your values. So negative b means the opposite of b. So b is negative 16. What's the opposite of negative 16? Positive 16 plus or minus square root. What do I put for b? Negative 16. If it's negative, you have to put parentheses around it. So the negative 16 needs to be squared minus 4. And what does AC mean? Multiply. So the minus 4 needs to be multiplied by 2 and 27. And then in the denominator, we'll have 2 times A, so this would be 2 times 2. Now you need to do some simplifying. I want one number, one number, one number. So x equals 16 plus or minus. We need to figure out what number goes under the radical. And for the denominator, what's 2 times 2? 4. Now, under the radical, we need to go ahead and simplify that. What is negative 16 squared? So this would be 256 minus, what's 4 times 2? 8. And what's 8 times 27? 216. So when you subtract 256 and 216, what do you get under the radical? 40. Now, after you have your 3 numbers, next step is simplify your radical. So can you simplify square root of 40? Yes. So this would be x equals 16 plus or minus. What's the perfect square for 40? So this would be 4 times 10 over 4. Mark out the 4. What's the square root of 4? 2. So this would be x equals 16 plus or minus 2 square root of 10 over 4. After you simplify your radical, you need to check these 3 numbers I'm highlighting. So the number out front, the number in front of the radical, the number in the denominator. Do those 3 numbers have a common factor? What's the common factor? 2. So divide all 3 of these numbers by 2 to simplify it. So what's 16 divided by 2? So 8 plus or minus, what's 2 divided by 2? 1. So this is just 1 square root of 10. And in the denominator, what's 4 divided by 2? 2. So there's our final answer. 8 plus or minus square root of 10 in the numerator and a 2 in the denominator. Next one, number 4. We have 3x squared plus 8 equals x. 3x squared plus 8 equals x. Is this equation in standard form? No. What has to move? The x. What happens to x when I move it to the other side? Changes to negative x. So this would be 3x squared minus x plus 8 equals 0. So once your equation is in standard form, I want you to write down the values for a, b, and c. What's the value for a? 3. What's the value for b? -1. What's the value for c? 8. Then copy down your quadratic formula. X equals -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. And in the denominator is the 2a. What does -b mean? Opposite of b. So if b is -1, what's the opposite of -1? +1. Plus or minus square root. What do we put for b? -1. If it's negative, you have to use parentheses. So -1 needs to be squared, then our -4. And what does AC mean? A times C, so we need to do 3 times 8. And in the denominator we'll have 2 times A is 3. Next thing I want you to do is I want you to simplify. So I want one number, and one number in the denominator. So for the denominator, 2 times 3 is 6. Simplifying our radical, what's -1 squared? 1. Then our minus, and what's 4 times 3? And what's 12 times 8? 96. What is 1 minus 96? -95. After you get it down to your 3 numbers, next part is simplify your radical. So can we simplify the square root of -95? Yes. If it's negative, what should be the first factor we write? -1. Is there a perfect square for 95? Does 4 work? Does 9 work? Does 16 work? 16 times what would give me 95? 16 times 6 is 96. So 16 wouldn't work. Would 25 work? Would 36 work? Would 49 work? Would 64 work? Would 81 work? No. So is there a perfect square for 95? No. So it's just -1 times 95. And in the denominator, a 6. Mark out the -1. What's the square root of -1? I. So this would be x equals 1 plus or minus I square root of 95. And in the denominator, we have a 6. Now check these 3 numbers. We have a 1, an I, and a 6. Do they have a common factor? No. If they did, you would divide out the common factor. But they don't, so this answer is our simplest form. Okay, number 5, we have -x plus 2 equals 2x squared. -x plus 2 equals 2x squared. Is this in standard form? Does it equal 0? No, so what has to move? The 2x squared. What happens to 2x squared when we move it to the other side? Becomes -2x squared. So -2x squared minus x plus 2 equals 0. then write down your A. What is A? -2. What is B? -1. What is C? 2. So x equals -b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. What does -b mean? Opposite. So if b is -1, what's the opposite of -1? +1. Plus or minus square root. What do I put for b? If it's negative, what does it have to have? So -1 in parentheses needs to be squared. Minus 4. What do we put for a? -2. What do we put for c? 2. And then the denominator is going to be 2 times what? -2. Now simplify. I want one number, one number, one number. So in the denominator, what's 2 times -2? -4. Now simplify underneath the radical. It's -1 squared. 1. Now we need to multiply these three. So what's -4 times -2? +8. And what's 8 times 2? +16. So this time we're not subtracting, because what's a negative times a negative? Positive. So this time it's not a minus, this time it's a plus. And 1 plus 16 is 17. Does that radical simplify? No. Check your three numbers. So we have a 1, a 1, a -4. Is there a GCF? No. So that's our answer. Now I added that 1 so you could see that nothing had a GCF with those three values. So I can go ahead and erase that. You didn't have to have it. Next one. Number 6, we have x squared equals -3x plus 7. X squared equals -3x plus 7. X squared equals -3x plus 7. Is that in the correct form? No, it's not. What does it have to equal? 0. So we have to take the -3x, move it to the other side. Take the 7, move it to the other side. So this would be x squared. What happens to -3x when we move it to the other side? Changes to +3x. What happens to +7? Changes to -7. Now it equals 0. I want you to finish problem 6. Find the value for A, B, and C, and get it down to simplest form. What's the value for A? B? C? So this would be x equals, what does negative B mean? The opposite of B. So if B is 3, I change it to a negative 3 plus or minus square root. What do I put for B? 3 squared minus 4. What do I put for A? 1. What do I put for C? Negative 7. Denominator would be 2 times 1. Simplify to just have 3 numbers only. So I have a negative 3 out front, 2 in the denominator. Find your answer under the radical. 3 squared is 9. Negative 4 times 1 would be, and negative 4 times negative 7, positive 28. So negative times a negative, this would be positive 28. What's 28 plus 9? 37? Does 37 simplify? No, there's not a perfect square. Now, negative 3, 1, and 2, is there a common factor? No. So it's just x equals negative 3 plus or minus square root of 37 and 2 in the denominator. We're going to skip problem 7, and I want you to do problem 8. Number 8, we have 5x squared plus 75 equals 0. Now, some of you would just be doing this on your homework. Don't do this because it's wrong. Should you be doing that? If it's a quadratic formula assignment, should you be doing square root property? No. Don't do that. It's wrong. Okay, so for number 8, what's the value for A? 5. What's the value for B? If it's not there, it's 0. So x is missing, so it's a 0x, because what's 0 times x? 0. That's why it's not there. So if it's not there, put a 0. And what is C? 75. Go ahead and finish number 8. All right, we'll go ahead and do this one together. What does negative B mean? Opposite of B. So what is B? 0. What's the opposite of 0? It's 0, right? 0 is neutral. It's not positive. It's not negative. So it would just be a 0 because negative 1 times 0 is just 0. But if I add 0 or subtract 0, is that going to change anything? So really, do I need a 0 out front? No. So I'm just going to leave it off. So this would just be plus or minus the square root. B squared would be 0 squared minus 4 times 5 times 75. And in the denominator, we'll have 2 times 5. And in the denominator, 2 times 5 is 10. Over here, what's 0 squared? 0. Put your minus. What's 4 times 5? 20. And what's 20 times 75? 1,500. So what's 0 minus 1,500? Negative 1,500. Is that radical in simplest form? No. If it's negative, what should be the first factor? Negative 1. And 1,500, what's the perfect square for 1,500? 100 times 15. Mark out the negative 1. What's the square of negative 1? I. Mark out 100. What's the square of 100? 10. So this would be x equals plus or minus 10i square root of 15 over 10. What happens next? 10s cancel, right? 10 on top, 10 on bottom. So what might answer be? X equals plus or minus I square root of 15. Okay, then we have 6 more problems, but they'll go a lot more quickly because we won't have to do the entire quadratic formula. But what's on the next screen, you do need to copy this down. At the very top, we have what's called the discriminant. You'll want to write down that formula. So the formula for the discriminant is b squared minus 4ac. b squared minus 4ac. And then copy down these 3 equations or inequalities. Copy down, just sketch a picture of what it looks like, and then copy down the words below it. You do need this. This will be tested on Tuesday, so make sure you write down everything on the screen. No, don't take a picture of it. You can't have a picture on the test. You can't have notes on the test either. So this one, if your discriminant is greater than 0, this is what the picture looks like. And notice below the picture, you need to write that it has 2 real zeros. And zeros just mean solutions, or x-intercept. So it will have 2 real solutions. If the discriminant equals 0, you'll only have 1 real solution. And if your discriminant is less than 0, that means you will have no real zeros, but you'll have 2 imaginary ones. And you'll want to make yourself a note. You need to memorize this. So the first one, the discriminant, b squared minus 4ac. First of all, the discriminant should look familiar. b squared minus 4ac, why does that look familiar? It's under the square root of what? Quadratic formula. b squared minus 4ac is what's under your square root. So if your discriminant is greater than 0, if a number is greater than 0, that means it's positive. So if it's positive under the square root, that means you'll have 2 real solutions. So you'll have 2 x-intercepts. If the discriminant is equal to 0, that means you only have 1 real solution. And over here, if your discriminant is less than 0, what does it mean if a number is less than 0? That means it's negative. So if the number under the square root is negative, you won't have any real solutions. You will have 2 imaginary solutions. And why would it be imaginary? Because you're taking the square root of a negative. What's the square root of -1? I, and what does I mean? Imaginary. So you need to know all of this information. Okay, so here's the next set of instructions. It says describe the zeros based on the discriminant. So go ahead and write that down. Describe the zeros based on the discriminant. Describe the zeros based on the discriminant. Describe the zeros based on the discriminant. Now when you describe these, you need to use what's written below those graphs. So it has 2 real solutions, it has 1 real solution, or it has no real solution but 2 imaginary solutions. So problem number 9 is b squared minus 4ac equals 144. Copy that down. B squared minus 4ac equals 144. Now notice my discriminant is equal to a positive. So if the discriminant is positive, if I go back, if the discriminant is positive, what does that tell me? That means there's 2 real zeros. So here when we describe the zeros, we need to say that there are 2 real zeros. Number 10, we have b squared minus 4ac equals negative 36. B squared minus 4ac equals negative 36. Now for this one, the discriminant equals a negative. So if your discriminant is equal to a negative, what does that tell me? There's no real zeros, but we have 2 imaginary zeros. So here this would be no real zeros. We have 2 imaginary zeros. So there's no real zeros, you have 2 imaginary. So they're not real, they're imaginary. And then number 11, we have b squared minus 4ac equals 0. B squared minus 4ac equals 0. And if I go back to my pictures, if your discriminant equals 0, what does that tell us? 1 real zero. So this one has 1 real zero. So if they ask you to describe, make sure you use those descriptions below the graph. And that's the part you have to memorize. There's 2 real zeros. There's 1 real zero. There's no real zeros but 2 imaginary. So memorize those 3. Now 3 more questions. Find the discriminant and describe the zeros. So find the discriminant and describe the zeros. Copy down the instructions so you know how to do it on the homework. So find the discriminant and describe the zeros. Find the discriminant and describe the zeros. And then problem 12, we have x squared minus 6x equals negative 7. X squared minus 6x equals negative 7. Now the first thing, just like with the quadratic formula, it has to be in standard form. So is that in standard form? No, we need to move the negative 7 to the other side. What happens to negative 7 when I move it to the other side? changes to positive 7. And then you need to list out A. What is A? 1. What is B? Negative 6. What is C? 7. Then you need to find the discriminant. So the discriminant is just B squared minus 4AC. So what do I put for B? So this would be negative 6 squared. So this negative, put it in parentheses. Minus 4. What do I put for A? 1. What do I put for C? 7. Simplify. Exponent first. What's negative 6 squared? 36. Put your minus. What's 4 times 1? 4 times 7? 28. When I subtract these, what do I get? 8. So my discriminant equals a positive. So if your discriminant equals a positive, what does that tell you about the zeros? 2 real zeros. So the discriminant is 8. And we have 2 real zeros. Okay, number 13. We have x squared minus 10x equals negative 25. X squared minus 10x equals negative 25. Just like with quadratic formula, put it in standard form. Is that in standard form? No. So we need to take the negative 25, move it to the other side. So this would be x squared minus 10x. What happens to negative 25 when we move it? Changes to positive 25. Then write down your A, your B, your C. So what is A? 1. What is B? What is C? 25. So the discriminant is B squared minus 4AC. So what do we put for B? Negative 10. Square it. Minus 4. What do we put for A? 1. What do we put for C? 25. Simplify that. What's negative 10 squared? 100. Put your minus. What's 4 times 1? What's 4 times 25? And what's 100 minus 100? 0. So if your discriminant is 0, how many solutions do you have? 1 real solution or 0. And we'll skip the last one. Your assignments. Let me give it to you.